Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And there's a lot about this one that we're going to pack in. For those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. And Chris is both the CTO and co-founder of a company in which we've invested, which also, if that was 1A, 1B is you can find This Is Not Advice on jam.ai, which is the startup that Chris has co-founded. And Chris also was for years an engineering leader at LinkedIn, and so understands the technical side of where you may be watching this right now, which is to say on LinkedIn. And so the question is one that Chris and I were bantering about after something on social, but he could share more, which is really for every professional, I feel like is so core. I can't believe we haven't done this one yet, which is I want to excel at work and I also want to live my life. And I go out there and I see all these things in the world that when I co-founded a company, one of our investors said, if you don't come in the office on Saturday, don't bother coming in on Sunday. And I was like, ooh, that's not the way I want to live as a dad with 2 kids and a human being. And so, Chris, would love any insights you have from any of the various contexts you've seen on how we can both excel and live our personal life.
Yeah. So, thank you for having me, Roy. I'm a huge fan of this show on both Jam and on LinkedIn. It's my job at Jam that inspired this conversation, but I think what I learned at LinkedIn is really what I'll draw from. So I was scrolling through a feed a few weeks ago and I saw a clickbaity kind of article that said, 12 reasons, 12 red flags in a potential co-founder. And one of the red flags was that your co-founder says X is more important than my startup. So it's kind of like your Saturday, Sunday thing. And that one really rubbed me the wrong way. I think that X is more important than my startup is a perfectly fine thing to say in lots of contexts. Like you, I have children. I have 3 kids. I'm very involved in the kids' school. There are lots of things that are very important to me. My co-founder also has 2 children. And, it's entirely appropriate for him to say, hey, I got to go to my son's baseball game today and I'll be back in a couple hours. Or I say, hey, Pete, I've got a board meeting this morning. I'll see you this afternoon. And I think that is an entirely appropriate thing to say. So that's what inspired this conversation.
So in a way, that's like a philosophical answer, which I happen to agree with. And I think that the question for many people, like you and I are fortunate, we have lots of forms of privilege, but one of them is we've had jobs at successful organizations where we got paid well and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. At the beginning of my career, I was nowhere near as confident as I am now in drawing those boundaries. So I think that the tradecraft question to me is, okay, I philosophically agree with you. It should be possible. And I reject the people who say, if you don't come in the office on Saturday, but 2 things. And so let me do the skeptical take. One skeptical thing is, well, that's cool, but you're just not going to be that successful. And your company is not going to be that successful. You personally are not going to be that successful. I mean, so many people say my secret was hard work, or I had intense periods. And I myself, had in periods where I worked so hard, like 2 a.m. in the office in government, over and over again. That's objection number 1 is like, that's great, but you're just not going to succeed, especially not at certain points in your career. And then the second thing is how? Okay, that's great. I want to do that, but I'm in an environment where it either is explicitly welcomed, but then I see people working hard, or it's not explicitly welcomed. So how do I do it? And I'm just curious what wisdom you have for people.
Yeah, you're right, and thank you for recognizing the privilege. It's easy to sort of be on the other side of it and say, "Oh, it's very easy. I just say this is important, and voila."
Well, now you're the boss. You can do that. You're
right,
the co-founder.
Exactly. And so, it does. I guess there's a few things. I think whether you're early in your career or whether you're at an executive in a company, I think being intentional with your time, being clear about what your boundaries are and what's important, is the starting place. I think, even if you're in your very first job, just having clarity about what's important to you and then learning to talk openly and authentically with your manager and your mentors and the people around you, right? So if going to the baseball game is important and your child has baseball every Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m., start by just naming it. Start by saying, hey, this is an important thing to me. One of the things my wife and I decided when we had our first child was that we wanted to prioritize dinner. right? That we were going to have dinner as a family every night. And so that is a boundary that I set, right? And then it really just starts with naming it and being clear about it. And then that allows you to start to explore the environment and the culture that you're in. And you may be, hopefully, especially today in the world, is much more open, I think, in general, at least in this part of the world, around mental well-being and these sorts of things. You may find that actually the people around you are more receptive to it than you might otherwise think. Right?
Yeah, I believe that. I mean, I think the only way to know how people respond is to try it and stick to it. And you do put yourself at some risk. Like, I remember when I was working for a consulting firm, there was this person who was like, it's 8, I'm going home. And the rest of us would stay, but he would go home. And did it annoy me because I was staying later? It did at times. But then over time, like even just a few days or a week, I was like, okay, cool. He's doing what he needs to do. And I think that the flip side of it is you have to be performing at your job. And that means, doing the work well. But the other weird thing that I've seen is sometimes when you try to do it, people end up respecting you more professionally. Like you think that doing whatever the boss wants is always the right answer. I had a boss once who was like, hey, we're meeting tomorrow at 11 a.m. And I was like, no, we're not, because I have a customer meeting tomorrow at 11 a.m. And he was definitely annoyed, but then he got over it. And I think he respected my boundaries. And I've definitely seen that there is not a linear relationship between the number of hours spent at work or the number of hours of moments spent outside of work hours getting things done and the results. And so I just kind of believe that you try to set your boundaries and see. And then the last thing I just say is it's a lot of timing and dosage that depends on the context, which is, if you're working at a hospital and you have a shift that's a certain number of hours and the person might die if you leave, there might be a totally different culture around what to do. But when people say like my startup is my baby, like be really careful with that language, because like a baby is like a human child. This thing is like a fictional thing that you've created that might be very meaningful to you and often deeply is. It might be a job. And both of those can be okay perspectives to have under different times. And I have seen wildly successful founders who are extremely constrained in how many hours a day they work. Not every founder, and I'd say the norm is not that, but trial and error.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things I'd love to say to that. Like, totally agree with you. I think both at work and in life, striving to figure out how you measure your success is important, right? And so it may be that you're measuring your success by how many hours you're in the office, or you're judging someone else by how many hours in the office. It sounds like you, in the story you told, started to recognize pretty quickly that it was actually more perhaps about their work output than the time that they were in the office, and that was become important. And I think, for me, it's a constant learning. I have to stop myself. Like, why is this important to me? What is it that I'm sort of using as a metric to understand whether I'm succeeding? The other thing, flipping it around, maybe more advice to managers, is to recognize, or not advice to managers, to recognize that you're constantly role modeling and sending signals in these things, right? It's how you choose your time. Using words, I try to eliminate words from my vocabulary, especially when it comes to things like performance reviews, about being busy or working hard. I think even if, it's not that you shouldn't celebrate that someone's working hard about something they're passionate about, but I wouldn't put a spotlight on it. You don't want people to think that the reason someone got promoted was because they were working hard, right? It has to do with the output they're doing. So that's
I love that. And I'll just say, the real talk of, first of all, on the self-awareness, it is really powerful. As like many things, it's like, well, why is that bothering me? Well, maybe it's because I have a sense of fairness that's being violated. It's not about anything other than that. And then it's like, okay, well, why do I have that? And then you can examine it a little bit. And then, I do think that real talk is there are workplaces where FaceTime, or the modern version of FaceTime, Slack being on or responsive to email, there are workplaces where that is valued in lieu of outcomes, because outcomes are harder to judge and inputs are more controllable by the individual and easier to judge. And I think that it's up to each person to do a little bit of a diagnosis of what is happening here. Like, am I being asked to work more because that's necessary for the goal? Because it's just the culture of the place? Have the two become conflated enough that I can't tell? And sometimes it's also, I'll just add one last coda, is it's not about hours worked. It's about preoccupation and intensity. For me, the single biggest interference of work with my personal life is not the hours worked. Like, I think I'm actually okay at managing that, but it is preoccupation. It's like, I can't get that thing somebody said to me on Friday afternoon out of my head. And kids made it a lot easier for me because they gave me something else to focus on that was obviously to me more important. That's a choice each individual makes. But I think another weird thing that happens is we tend to look for obvious examples like, oh, he can go on vacation because he just got engaged and that's their trip. But it's like, no, anybody should be able to take vacation for any reason without needing to a life event. If you want to go on a date, you should be able to go on a date, whether or not you have like kids or whatever. And if all you want to do is leave the office and meditate, like, I kind of think it's important to respect that somebody else's reasons might not be legible as yours. I'm curious, how that lands and any parting thoughts before we wrap.
Oh, I think it is very wise. It took me many years, and I'm still trying to learn to not sort of project what's important to me on other people. Right? It's one of the first things I think you have to learn as you manage. And it's a constant thing. You kind of I have to check myself on. And I'm just going to come back to what I said earlier. I think the most important skill, because you grounded this on like what can people at any phase in their career take from this, is to be open and authentic about these things. I think to your manager, to your peers, find mentors that can help you, because you probably don't know exactly what they're thinking, how you should be behaving. And if you start to bump up against cultural things that aren't right for you, then now you can start to address those, right?
Yeah. I mean, I do think exposing that is so important. And it makes me think about a situation where I was a terrible role model and how I handled it, which is I had COVID last week, the week before as well. And I took a few days of taking it easy, but then I was working pretty intensely. And I said to my team, like, I feel bad about this because this is not how I want you to work when you have COVID. But this is how I am working right now. And it's like, I figured better to at least acknowledge that I was a bad role model on that than not. But that openness and authenticity, I think, is such a great closing note. And it's a skill and one you can build. And the reason we call this is not advice, you kind of made a passing reference, is just because, we have our own experiences that we're sharing with people. But what somebody watching should do in your case, I don't know. If you want to see more of this, by the way, you can find This Is Not Advice on Jam. That is the very helpfully formatted URL. Somebody who knew what they were doing in engineering made this very easy to follow. jam.ai/jam/this is not advice with hyphens in between. And if you want to find it in text form and links to the past videos, you can find that at thisisnotadvice.work. And I just want to say, Chris, like, I would just love to keep doing this because I feel like one of the ways we figure this stuff out is through a process of muttering to each other about it. And the fact that you and I get to talk about it and I get to hear how you've thought about it and be reminded, like, oh yeah, management is about not assuming that what somebody else is going through. I really gain a lot from that. So I'm grateful.
Great. Thank you, Roy. It's a pleasure.
All right. To be continued.